American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 9, Public Opinion and Political Socialization. The learning objective for this segment will be to appreciate the role of an individual's background in the forming of their political opinions. So the main question we're dealing with here is, how do people form their opinions on government and the public policies that come from government? Ultimately, there are multiple factors that play a role, and probably the first and most influential role is played by the family. The family indirectly, casually, and incompletely socializes individuals. It's indirect because parents instruct their children on private matters that are not obviously political, but it still has an influence on political opinions. It is casual because the parent's role is casual. The beliefs are more likely to occur as a side effect than formal instruction. And ultimately, it's incomplete because children are relatively free to experiment in different political environments. As children grow older, they meet up with other individuals, they experience new things, and their public opinion attitudes and their attitudes towards government and policies ultimately will change with their experiences. Now, the schools is what the children go to next. And this is the most formal institution for political socialization. And ultimately, when we think of the public school system, it was put together to tie together a diverse nation by bringing different people together and helping them understand the values that all Americans hold dear, which is why the public schools are considered possibly one of the most important political socialization forces. However, when it comes to belief acquisitions, it has a very little impact, but it does have an impact on the likelihood of whether or not students ultimately will become involved in politics as they grow older. Specifically, those students who become involved in student government are more likely to become politically involved citizens. Now, social class certainly has a role. And this is referred to as a socioeconomic status, and this can be such things as the level of education and income, which contributes to social class. And this influences people's perceptions. And arguably, the higher the level of education and income, the more tolerant an individual will be. Now, specific research suggests that the higher the education, the more likely an individual will choose freedom and liberty over the options of order and equality in society. And this might be due to them having more opportunities and wishing to use these opportunities effectively. Likewise, we see that the higher the income an individual has, the more likely the individual will see government as an umpire. In other words, they'll rely upon government only to make sure that the system works fair. Of course, fairness might be tied with where they are in the political system, and if you're doing well, then obviously the system's fair. Now, on the other hand, the lower the income, the more likely an individual will see the role of government as being parental, because it's a means of bringing them from a negative place economically, socially, and living status as well. Now, religion is something that affects both broad and specific public opinions. Now, religion has been tied with party identification historically, but it's also been tied with specific issues. For instance, the Quakers, because of their nonviolent status, tend to favor disarmament. The Jews tend to support aid for Israel. Catholics and Southern Baptists, well, because of their faith, they oppose the use of federal funds for abortion. Now, sex and gender, which are two connected concepts, does too play a very important role, especially as there's greater tendencies of overlapping bell curves here, and that they have different views on such things as abortion, gun control, nuclear power, crime, and environmental issues, and so on. What we find is that men tend to be more interested in power issues, such things as national defense and finance, whereas women tend to be more interested in nurturance issues such as education, the environment, healthcare, and so on. Now, in both these cases, it might be tied with some of their biological predispositions. Whereas women, if they have to raise children, they want to make sure that the environment is safe, that there is resources for education, that they can take care of their children through health care if necessary. Whereas men, who tend to see themselves as more of protectors and providers, which of course has changed over the years, might see themselves as more interested in national defense and finance issues. Now, age also influences perspectives. Now, cohort refers to changes in a person based upon a generation. So, for instance, if you're born in a generation that their first major experience was the terrorist attacks of 9/11, this is going to influence your attitudes towards government and how it should respond to external threats. Likewise, if you're born during the Great Depression, you'll see government radically differently than others who have grown up in more prosperous times. Now, life cycle refers to changes in a person over their lifespan, with the idea that certain events are going to influence how people view government and its role. So, for instance, when people have children, they tend to look upon government, especially at the local level, and its ability to provide good education is highly important. When you buy a house, you want to make sure that your house values are kept stable. But this might not be important for someone the younger they are. Now, what we see with figure 9.4b is that political ideology changes by age group. So ultimately, even though ideology is an incomplete measure, and we'll talk about this in this lecture a little bit further along, we see that there are changes in the population over a period of time. But certainly, political ideology is one of these broad concepts that as you become older, people tend to become more conservative because they want to maintain what is currently there. It's a more stable environment, which is what conservatism is arguably about. Now, geographic factors certainly play a role in political perspectives on a variety of issues. The region of the country that you live in, the people that surround you, whether you live in an urban versus rural area, is going to influence you on a host of different perspectives. For instance, if you live in a rural area, you probably have grown up in a gun culture where the expectations as far as the freedom to buy guns and to use guns is pretty much expected. Whereas if you live in an urban area where guns are seen as a threat to someone's safety, and there are police around to protect you on a regular basis, then gun control issues might be something that you are more in favor of. So certainly geography plays a role on a broad range of different issues. Groups likewise influence people, and this is based upon reference groups. Individuals might have a variety of different views, but ultimately, because humans are group beings, we moderate or change our views that might not be appreciated or even might upset our friends and colleagues. Now, our primary groups are likely going to have a greater influence on us and our opinions because these are the people that we come into contact with face to face on an everyday basis. Whereas those secondary groups, which we come in contact on a less frequent basis, for instance, softball teams or fraternities or sororities once you get out of college, or even churches, they'll have an influence, but not as much as those people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, party identification certainly plays a role, and it influences how an individual thinks. And this is oftentimes because we look at political parties as a simple heuristic to help us make political decisions. But it's also because humans are group beings. And that leads to a question as to whether party identification is driven by group identity. In other words, you've always been a member of this group and therefore they're correct, or it's political ideology that's underlying this. Ethnicity is also an issue. And this certainly plays a role in redistribution of wealth and other issues of equality and equity, especially if you're a group that has suffered at the hands of the majority over a long period of time, or if you see that you haven't really played a role in affecting anyone else. And so certainly who you are and how people respond to you based upon your physiological characteristics can influence how you think about different policy options and public opinion towards the government and what its role is. Now finally, biological factors play a role. And this is something that's only been recently been studied to a great extent. And this is basically the idea that attitudes and opinions have a genetic component. Now, it's not a direct thing, such as, well, you've got this genotype and thus you must believe this, but there's an interaction between inherited dispositions and complex environmental factors that leads to different beliefs and attitudes. Now, this can be seen in individuals' personality. In other words, their predispositions to different attitudes and behavior. And some of the most interesting research, including some research that I've carried out myself, considers the role of traits of fear and disgust and how they play a role in how people respond politically to different issues. Now, if you look at fear and disgust, it's not just whether you have these traits, but also what environment you're in and how adaptive these traits are for you in that environment. So ultimately, when we consider public opinion, it's not just about the tools by which this opinion is obtained. It's not just about the different attitudes that people have, but it's also what's behind these attitudes and understanding it to a fuller extent. And understanding that it plays a very important role in how our representatives represent us. American national government.